Lecture Series and for having me this evening. Let me try to share my screen. So I think it should work now.
Yes.
So yeah, indeed, the idea for the next 30 minutes was to give you a brief overview on what we are doing in the project FileLook and yeah, how we try to integrate how and why actually we try to integrate justice aspects into activities in wildfire risk management. So let me start with setting the scene a little bit and give you an idea on what the project is about. So FireLog is a 4-year project that was funded under the European Green Deal and has introduced its a coordination and support action that has received about 3 million in funding. And what is interesting is that under the European Green Deal, there was a specific call on preventing and fighting extreme wildfires with the integration and demonstration of innovative means. And under this, so there was one call, and for those who are familiar with research and innovation funding at the European scale, so there was one call and 3 very large projects were funded under this call. It's a very large investment from the European Commission side of about 60 million in total. And what you see here are the 3 large so-called innovation actions with up to almost 50 partner organizations. And then there was another wildfire risk management precursor project funded in another call of about 40 partner organizations. So you see these are very large projects. And in order to synthesize the results and to coordinate all these activities a little bit, FireLook was funded. So in that sense, we are not necessarily a research project, but the main purpose is to organize, understand, integrate the results that the projects are producing. So the FireLook goals are on the one hand side to support the project. So of course we do the random things like facilitating communication, support joint conference participation and so on. And we try to synthesize the project results, but we also have to try to develop policy recommendations at the European scale specifically that are consistent across the project. So yeah, this is not an easy task. And yeah, having said that, overall wildfire risk management is a complex challenge. Since I was not sure who would be attending tonight, yeah, I was trying to find a balance between giving you a little bit of a more general introduction. So yeah, I would say as compared with other natural hazards, wildfires is one of the more complex ones due to the interdependencies between human behavior, socioeconomic development, and inequalities. Then we have the climate impacts and also the vegetation resources, otherwise known as fuel or fuel load. So I think what's interesting is with wildfire risk, this is one of the, or if not the only hazard where we actually have the opportunity to actively shape the hazard itself in the ways we manage the landscapes, we manage the vegetation. But at the same time, due to this very close interrelation with the modulation of landscapes, this is also a multi-stakeholder challenge that requires to involve different societal actors, institutions, political actors with their different expectations and perceptions. And because of that, of course, there can be different aims related to wildfire risk management. So such as sustainability, the economic use of resources, nature conservation. So different types of stakeholders will have different interests and goals that may actually also clash. So having that in mind and having this this complex landscape, let's say, of projects and project organizations and results, when applying for the research or for the project funding, we were thinking a little bit of how could we actually make sense of all of that, and how could we deal with the potential that several stakeholders might potentially want to have different suggestions in terms of the policies they would like to see developed, the interests they have in wildfire risk management as a whole. So we came up with the idea to look a little bit deeper into aspects of justice. So, of course, this is nothing that, yeah, that we came up from scratch, but it is embedded into larger developments and conceptual developments. So, just transition as such is a concept for low carbon transition, and basically it's a concept that was very much coined by the labor movement in relation to to the transition to a low carbon economy, with the idea that green and decent jobs should be promoted in that transition away from fossil fuels. And it also relates to the assumption that justice and equity must form an integral part of a low carbon transition in order to avoid the reproduction the reproduction, let's say, of inequalities and power asymmetry. So in that sense, this is very much related to mitigation efforts, to labor movements. I've put here just two of the publications you might be interested in. And since, as I said at the beginning, Firelog is also a project that was funded under the European Green Deal, and the European Green Deal as such aims for Europe to become the first climate neutral continent by 2050. It aims that the transition should be an incentive also for economic growth and innovation, and that overall this transition should also reduce dependencies from unreliable partners and boost energy autonomy. So in that sense, Europe aims to become the first climate neutral continent by 2050. And here you see this relation already to the just transition movement, since it was also stated from the very beginning that there's not only this target to become climate neutral by 2050 and to decouple economic growth from resources use, but very much also that no person and no place was left behind, and that overall there should be solidarity with the most affected regions in Europe, such as the coal mining regions. So just transition as such has become a core concept of the European Green Deal, and that was also one of the reasons why we thought, okay, so if this is one of the core concepts for the transition that we are currently facing, then potentially we should also see how we could apply it to wildfire risk management. So the just transition concept in Europe has been very much translated also into financial mechanisms. So just to give you an overview, what we see here, the Just Transition Fund was created. The EU invests into specific schemes. There's a public sector loan facility for these transitions, specifically to provide funding for the regions that are affected most in terms of labor, of course, and in economic terms. So what we did then was to look into a related concept on environmental justice, and again, I put just two of the many publications that are out there, since it's a concept that addresses the equitable distribution of environmental risks and benefits. So what you see here, for example, is a publication from 2008, a German one. Since health-related burdens, for example, are frequently not equally distributed, but would affect different parts of society in very different ways. Overall, environmental justice relates to the idea that all parts of the society should be involved in environmental governance, and it explores the aspects of justice in relation to cause and effects of environmental harm. So you might have come across the polluter pays principle, with the idea that those who are actually responsible for environmental harm, they should also pay for it. So with these two conceptual grounds, we looked a little bit deeper also into environmental justice aspects, trying to apply these aspects to wildfire risk management. And I think specifically the environmental justice literature is very helpful because it it differentiates three types of justice. So basically, distributional justice in terms of how are environmental risks and responsibilities actually distributed across society. So who's affected, who's causing environmental harm, who's impacted by that. Then also procedural justice, so the question of who's actually involved in decision-making processes and who has a voice or who hasn't. And then finally, restorative justice. So the question, how can we potentially compensate any harm or senses of injustices? So yeah, that was our conceptual basis that we applied when looking deeper into that. And from the conceptual point of view, we were wondering how we could actually translate these justice aspects into disaster risk management along the risk management cycle. So namely from prevention to preparedness to response and recovery, what aspects could be useful. Then we also wanted to explore and how far the integration of justice aspects could actually be helpful and really transcend the original purpose of wildfire risk management. And also we wanted to sketch out how the systematic consideration of justice aspects could really facilitate more integrated and inclusive management strategies. So that was the idea. So all these conceptual grounds were finally translated into paper, which you will find here. So we developed a framework for considering justice aspects in integrated wildfire risk management. And we basically specified all these questions related to wildfire risk management along the risk management cycle. So that was the conceptual grounds. Yeah, let me, before I go into a little bit more detail on the justice aspects that we identified along the risk management cycle, dive a little bit deeper into the challenges for integrated wildfire risk management due to climatic change, but also to changing socioeconomic and ecological conditions. So just a few examples. I will not read everything. What you see here is that we have coded it. So we have identified a number of challenges for integrated wildfire risk management, for example, in the prevention phase, but also for recovery and adaptation. And you will find more if you look into the publication. It's open access. And what you see here is that these stands for distributional justice aspects, P is for the procedural justice aspects, and R for the restorative aspects. So, you know, just a couple of aspects are that, for example, we have limitations in terms of modeling increasing and or unprecedented risk scenarios. So, yeah, we see that the wildfire events are becoming more and more extreme. And here at the moment, we have limitations on predicting how will these extremes actually be distributed, and how can we actually potentially, yeah, design any restorative or compensatory mechanisms for that. Then we have, for example, challenges in engaging stakeholders, especially in new fire-prone areas. So in those areas where it's a rather new phenomenon, it's specifically challenges to have really all relevant stakeholders on board. Yeah, and for example, in the recovery and adaptation phase, there are aspects of cascading effects in ecosystem services. So, for example, biodiversity conservation or water provision. We have impacts on the insurance sector, specifically as wildfire events become more and more frequent and more intense. This is something that we see, for example, most recently now in the US and Florida with the recurring hurricanes, that this has a tremendous impact on the insurance sector. So these are just some of these aspects that we believe make it more and more relevant to actually talk about the justice dimension. So yeah, I will give you now some examples on how we framed these justice aspects in terms of distributional justice, procedural justice, and restorative justice for different phases. So what you see here are the The gray boxes are relating to the risk management phases. So, for example, in terms of distributional justice and prevention, the question is, does the widespread use of a shared responsibility concept actually result in exclusion of those who aren't or can't be proactive in doing what is expected from them? So if we assume this is specifically in the Southern European countries, the case that people are to clean their houses from the surrounding fuel, and the overall idea that is that there's a shared responsibility in society where everyone has to take care of their own risk reduction measures. Then what does it mean if you don't have the capacity or you're old and you can't like technically health-wise take care of these matters? Like how do we deal with that? Then in terms of preparedness, for example, are citizens equally and adequately informed about potential residual risks? So that relates very much to the question of how do we actually communicate that the public services, the firefighters will not always be able to prevent each and every harm. How do we communicate that? Are people aware of that? Then in terms of response, for example, how are workload and resources distributed between career and voluntary emergency management services? And in terms of recovery and adaptation is the question like who's actually paying for adaptation to a changing wildfire environment? Are there any public funds available, or do the households or businesses, are they responsible for covering any adaptation measures? And again, like these are just some examples. Then in terms of procedural justice, for example, again, going through the risk management cycle, the question is, for example, how does prevention through biomass management affect different functions of forests? So if we assume, for example, that we need fuel reduction in order to avoid very extreme events, then what does that mean in terms of the economic use of forests? What does that mean in terms of recreational purposes, of ecosystem services, and so on? And who's actually then in the end deciding on how different forests or landscape are treated? Which kind of stakeholders are involved in these processes? In terms of preparedness, for example, what is the necessary degree of adaptation required from different members of the society? So what needs to change? What prevention measures should actually be taken? In the response phase, for example, who decides where to put emphasis on in emergency situations? And we are more and more discussing, this was something that was quite prevalent, for example, at the Civil Protection Forum this year in Brussels, is that specifically in case of several simultaneous events, like where do you put your resources according to what criteria, who makes these decisions? And then in the end, of course, that also relates to liability questions. And if we talk about recovery and adaptation, there's a question on whether stakeholders are equally considered in restoration and adaptation plans. Is there an equal access to insurance mechanisms? How is that organized at all? And the landscape is vast across Europe. From state to state, whether they are public insurance mechanisms or state-driven schemes. So yeah, there are a lot of questions related to that. And finally, in terms of restorative justice, the last cycle I would like to present to you is in terms of prevention, the question who should bear the costs and benefits of urban and land use planning, for example. It's very clear that more needs to be invested into agroforestry, into bioeconomy schemes that develop the landscape to effectively reduce disaster risk. Yeah, but who's actually taking care of it, who's carrying the costs, and who's benefiting from that in the end? In terms of preparedness, are the opportunity costs of access restrictions, for example, for high fire risk days properly compensated? So something that, that happens frequently, specifically in Southern Europe, is that, for example, natural park or recreational areas, they're closed down because the wildfire risk is just too high, and the visitors are also sources like, one says that around 90% of the ignitions are human caused, sometimes by negligence, but also by accident. So they are closed down, but then the question is if this is a source of income for the region, who's actually compensating for that if more and more days are high wildfire risk days. So, or for example, tourists would actually in the end cancel their trip. So that's also a very very important economic question. In terms of the response, is the question how to communicate certain losses have to be accepted so that, yeah, potentially not everything can be avoided. How do we compensate if certain areas are sacrificed because they cannot be defended? And finally, how was past or expected harm included into the adaptation plans of urban and land use planning? So yeah, I believe that if we, as I depicted now, if we look a little bit deeper into all those justice questions, we realize that yeah, it can actually reveal quite a couple of questions and give important or can inform, let's say, in a very important way, the discussions and the suggestions that we might want to take. So just to give you a more practical example also that was related to our work was the consideration of justice aspects and wildfire risk management targets. And interestingly, the Green Deal or the call that was issued for the research and innovation funding was related with a number of targets. So these targets have been highly debated in themselves, and they were not set in stone. I think they were more thought to guide the research projects with respect to the impact that they are to unfold. But it said that the project should contribute to, for example, zero fatalities from wildfires, to 90% reduction of losses from wildfires insured, or to the control of wildfires in less than 24 hours. So applying this justice lens, we were also wondering, like, if we, not necessarily these targets, but it could be any targets or objectives that we design for wildfire risk management, is always the question, are these targets actually desirable? Are they feasible? And potentially different stakeholders might have different views on that. In terms of the control of wildfires, for example, some of you might have come across the fire paradox that, of course, the more we suppress the fires, the more fuel will build up that is then available later on for even larger fires. So yeah, there are actually very, very many debatable aspects in here. Also, we have very inconsistent data sets across Europe, sometimes also very limited or hardly any data to be actually able to develop a baseline assessment or to monitor any progress of such targets. So yeah, and then in the end, if we develop any targets, was the question, how do we distribute it? Like, are these targets to be addressed at the national level or at the EU level? And like, would the contributions have to be divided equally across the member states, or maybe just we would develop different shares in contributing to that? So there were really a lot of interesting questions that all had this justice notion. But coming back to the project and maybe explaining to you why, like in the end, why did we do all that? So again, our idea was to make use of this justice lens to drive the discussions or to systematize the discussions with the representatives from the different projects working on these innovations. So FireLoc set up 5 different working groups. So we have designed one working group on environmental and ecology aspects, one for societal aspects. Then we have the infrastructure, insurance, and civil protection working groups. And basically the idea was to have representatives from all of the projects that I mentioned at the very beginning, and to assign them to those working groups in order to discuss their research, their innovations, in order to better understand what are the opportunities related to these solutions, what are the challenges, and what are the justice aspects that they bring. And then we were expecting that potentially we would have this clashes that we initially mentioned, that, for example, a measure proposed by the environmental or ecology working group would not necessarily make sense from a civil protection point of view. So that was the main idea. And we then went through 2 workshop cycles. So what you see here, like here we have the working groups, and this is workshop cycle number 1, workshop cycle number 2. And the first workshop cycle, which was implemented in 2023, focused a lot on socio-economic aspects and climate change mitigation and adaptation research coming from the mentioned innovation actions. And then the second workshop cycle was implemented this year in April. And here we focused more on the implications of technologies and Earth observation innovation. So what you see here is a brief overview on the more specific topics that the working groups worked with. So the Environment and Ecology Working Group focused on barriers and synergies towards landscape resilience, and how different sectoral policies would actually influence landscape modulation. Then we have the Societal Working Group that was dealing a lot with injustices in governmental communication, but also, for example, with vulnerability to wildfires within minority groups. Then the Civil Protection Working Group dealt more with requirements and needs at the European scale, but also they worked a lot on, for example, lacking regulative context for the application of sorry, of new technologies such as heavy payload drones, for example. So there are a lot of things currently being developed, specifically also drones and robots, and it's not yet entirely clear how that could work in an operational environment. Then we had the Insurance Working Group that dealt with equitable wildfire insurance and risk transfer. So the question, who pays in the end? How can we set up insurance mechanisms and risk transfer incentives that that would help to reduce wildfire risk. And then finally, the Infrastructure Working Group, which dealt with the questions of how infrastructure is a driver for wildfires, and also the question, how do wildfires actually impact existing infrastructures, and what is being developed at the moment in order to reduce wildfire risk caused by infrastructures. So what you see here, just to give you some illustration, that was our first workshop in Solsona in July 2023 in Spain, and we were more than 50 physical participants. And the overall idea, I have not included that slide, was that initially the participants worked in their working groups and discussed the innovations that are currently in the making. And in the second step, we mixed them up. So we had cross working groups where one representative from each working group, they were all mixed up, and then they discussed, they presented their initial discussions, and that was specifically fruitful. So as I said initially, it's a complex topic with very many stakeholders involved, as you see, like from insurance to infrastructures, to civil protection, to land use planning, to forestry. And just to give you an overview of a couple of multi-stakeholder topics that we discussed was, for example, in terms of infrastructure, how can joint public and private efforts to protect infrastructures look like? How can we prepare citizens for infrastructure shutdowns? But also, how could cooperations between operators and civil protection agencies look like? And in terms of insurance, for example, there was a question, how could insurance mechanisms actually incentivize infrastructure resilience? How could nature-based solutions be integrated into insurance products and practices? So yeah, this is really just a snapshot of the topics that we discussed. And finally, and that was the initial idea, as I said, was the idea to apply this justice lens to distill a number of topics and potentially conflicting ideas to, in the end, develop some suggestions for policies. So here, for example, here you see the icons. So these are the working groups that that had a say in that. Was, for example, the question, how's the liability of operators in case of causing wildfire ignitions? Are they actually liable? How are these procedures potentially organized? How could one incentivize the use of nature-based solutions such as grazing, for example, or prescribed burns for risk reduction? Can we develop insurance mechanisms that somehow encourage the use of such solutions? Then the question, how do we ensure equal access to warnings? And that translates into many questions, not only technologies, but also language issues and so on. How can we fine-tune evacuation versus sheltering procedures? So there were a lot of discussions on the question whether or not to evacuate or rather shelter, the preconditions that would need to be in place for successful sheltering. So basically there would have to be local community plans on, who stays, who does what, and who leaves. Then also the question, for example, what are liability issues related to commander's decision if decision support tools fail? So that was a very large discussion around the innovations that are currently being developed, because we have a lot of decision support tools, fire modeling solutions. But the question was, okay, if we really want to use that in an operational context and the software is wrong, then whose liability is that in the end? Is it the liability of the IT provider, or like what are the legal implications if the decisions are based on that? And also the question, I think I briefly mentioned that already, how to communicate capacity limits. Yeah, so these were some of the questions or triggering questions from which we are currently developing policy recommendations. And I think we're now more or less on time. And that was also my last slide. You would find the references, because I think that the slides will be shared in the aftermath. And with that, thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you for the interesting talk. I saw we had a few contributions in the chat. I think Dr. Ulrich Kimolino, if you could just, because you wrote a lot, if you could just maybe elaborate on what you wanted to ask or contribute.
Yeah, hello for me. Thanks for the presentation. Quite interesting. I never heard about this project before. I'm the head of wildfire group from the German Federal Fire Organizations, also from Deutschen Feuerverband. And I'm also a member of the ZTF Forest Fire Commission. So you asked before the report to write in the chat some ideas or comments or something else, and I did this. It's not quite a lot of questions, it's also some comments. First comments are, I think it's a lot of talking about emotional things I cannot understand. Like you talk about the vibrant urban interface problem. If someone is not able to clean up the area around the house, who should be responsible for that? If he's not able to do this, he cannot live there.
Yeah, maybe let me briefly respond to that before we go to the other questions. So thanks for the comment. Yes, I mean, yeah, one could agree to that comment, but what we see, for example, in Portugal is that basically the legal obligation to clear the environment around the houses is with the house owner, which makes, of course, sense. But in the end, we see also that in many regions, this is simply not happening because there's either lack of machinery, let's say, or simply old people that are not able to take care of these issues. So what I'm trying to say is that from a legal point of view, the issue is clear, but it doesn't solve the problem.
The problem is quite bigger. You mentioned in the starting of the discussion or the report a little about the socio-economic problems. And a lot of these things you mentioned now, like in Portugal, we have also in other countries in the world. The changing from land living area with farmers, even with very small farmer living areas, to nowadays more living in cities or having bigger landscape use for bigger machineries is totally different from 50 years ago. And even the stupid things like how to do a bio winery can have impact to wildfire. I couldn't believe, but the French guys explained it to me. In former days, they had a vineyard and they take a tractor and a plug and they go through the winery and they had earth, open earth, between the bushes, the vine grapes. And if they had a map and they saw a vineyard, it was a safe region because the fire would not go very speedy through. It would go softly, smoothly, and maybe the wind is coming and yeah, maybe then is a problem, but you have time, you can look at it. Nowadays, a lot of vineyards have a grass bottom. They have no earth, they have grass. And if the grass is not cut it, because it's also, it costs money to send a tractor with a mowing machine and to cut the grass. If the grass is growing up and you have maybe a wet spring and then have a dry summer, you can have a speed up area in a vineyard. And it's a very new phenomenon in the last years. The French guys told it to me. And there's a lot of so small things you cannot overview from Germany, because it's different in Germany to French or Portugal or Spain. And we have a lot of these problems. And the Italy, you have regions where the farmers go away from these hilly regions because it's no machinery is possible. They have to do the work by their own hands. And all these areas, wineries and olive oil trees go in wildland with bushes and no streets, no ways for fire department. And if there's a fire, it goes very speedy through. We have this in Greek, we have this in I think in all Southern Europe countries. And this is a very big problem. I think the EU has some projects to give money to pay farmers to avoid this, but it's the areas are so big. I cannot see a solution for this. Sure, the house and to wide and urban interface problem around the house is a problem, but the problem is quite a lot bigger.
Yeah, I think sorry to interrupt, but I think this is a misunderstanding here, maybe, because I mean, maybe I should have included some additional slides on wildfire risk as such and how it developed or how it's characterized in different countries across Europe, because I think this is clear. The point I was trying to make is that we found it useful, first of all, from a conceptual point of view, to look a little bit deeper into these justice aspects and trying to understand who's actually involved in decision-making processes, what implications do certain measures have if they are taken by a certain stakeholder, and what implications do these decisions have on other types of stakeholders, and in the end also to understand what are the implications of the innovations that are coming from the projects. And I think one of the last points that I was trying to depict is that we found like just this lens of that we applied to the discussions quite useful, since, for example, some of the technological advances from a justice or ethics point of view bring quite interesting implications, such as the decision support systems and the question who's in the end liable if you build your decisions on an IT mechanism, right? So yeah, I think I'm not saying that this is like the questions on, you know, whether or not you're able to clear your house is the main driver of wildfire risk, but that we found this lens or applying that lens quite useful. But I don't know. I think there were further questions in the chat.
The next thing was the costs about if you close an area. I've seen it in French. The French guys close up the entrance into the wildland if they have a high risk. Nobody pays for it. Nobody, because the same problem is in the in skiing or in other sporting areas or in sailing, maybe on the water. If you have bad weather, depending to your sport, what you will do, it's bad weather. There's no sports. Same problem is here. I cannot see how and who should pay for this different risks. This discussion is, I think, a very maybe only emotional way. It's not helpful for me because the problems on other sides. You can see the difference between France and Germany. If the French guys close the forests, if there is a high risk area, and Germany discuss, oh, we have the right to go in the forest. We cannot close the forest. And then they wonder why they have in Waldbrandgefahrensstufe 4 or 5, they have the fires because people going around smoking cigarettes, throwing it away. Nobody's controlling it. In France, they control this. They go inside the forest and control the guys walking around. If they are the right way, that makes their fire or not, and you will be set for guilty if they catch you. That's different in each country.
Yeah, of course this is different in each country, but the question, like specifically if we're talking about a change in wildfire risk management landscape, and we see that more and more days these parks are closed, for example, and of course this has implications, and this has economic implications and implications for the people, or like for the landscape planning decisions, right? So, I mean, what I'm trying to say is that these were just some examples, and I'm not saying that one of these problems is the main driver, but looking closer, we see that, yeah, okay, you're closing down the park, of course, then there's no sports or there's no recreation or whatsoever. But just applying that way of thinking was able to depict what are the implications, what are the economic implications, how are different stakeholders impacted by decisions related to that, and how could that potentially change as wildfire risk is increasing. So I'm not sure, but that if that makes sense for you, but that was the point of thinking.
Next point of view I discussed last year in the meeting with the foresters and farmers and landowners in Berlin and with insurance agencies. At the fires 2022 in Germany, we had a lot of problems with windmills, wind turbines standing in the forests and getting smoke and some flames from the forest fires we had 22. And I tried to discuss this with the owners from the land and with insurance agents and also with the turbine owners, who is responsible for what? If we got a fire in the turbine and you have a fire in the forest, and then maybe the next turbine area by another owner, who insures this and for which money? Forest is nothing worth. The hectare forest is no money. But one windmill is about 80 million euros. So it's they just start to discuss about these problems, and the same problem we have with photovoltaic. They built huge regions in photovoltaic in Bavaria, and if you have fires, you get the glass broken and spread away, and it costs a huge amount of money to clean it up. the discussions about these costings just started now.
Yeah, but
Everybody
I
wants
think,
to earn money, but nobody wants to discuss
yeah,
about risks.
but I think in that sense, I would actually presuppose that we actually agree, because this is, this is what we were also depicting. Like, the question is not only related to windmills or to photovoltaic installations, but specifically in Southern Europe also to energy providers, the energy lines that you would have in the that go through the forest, for example, and that through sparking would cause wildfires. And if if it's kept in the forest, and you say that the forest as such is not, is not much worse. But if it spreads, and if it spreads to urban areas, for example, then is indeed the question, who's responsible for it, who's liable for it, who's responsible for recovering these impacts. So yeah, that and as you rightly say, these are questions that are just coming up, and they're coming up all across Europe. And this is why through these discussions we are trying to come up with a number of suggestions, which we are drafting right now on how do we deal with infrastructures and their infrastructures causing wildfire ignitions. How do we set up proper insurance mechanisms that also take these aspects into consideration?
Okay, then we had one more question from Ayosha Maya. I would just read it out loud. I understand that justice aspects are really a cross-cutting topic. Are there any operationalization attempts yet in the different working groups or projects?
Yeah, I don't really know how to answer that question. I mean, what I was trying to show is that we are operationalizing it. So we try to apply it to our workshop concepts and try to use it to structure the discussions in these working groups in order to draft the recommendations, the policy recommendations that we would develop at the European level. And then, of course, we're also trying to propose that this justice lens and these aspects of distributional, procedural, and restorative justice should be applied for wildfire risk management more widely. So I think in that sense, that's the second step, because we also have the discussions at the European scale. How do we actually move forward? How do we develop a roadmap for wildfire risk management that could be adopted by the member states? My notion is that it would also be a proposal to integrate these justice aspects more widely. But I mean, also, frankly speaking, and this is also what you see in this discussion right now, is that it's a rather different way of thinking, and not everyone finds it useful, or not finds it not useful at first sight, let's say. And interestingly, over the last 2 years of discussions with the working group, with the representatives from the projects, we had very many skeptical participants at the beginning. But as we started the discussions and we came back to that topic, I think more and more people realized that it could actually add value. So my feeling is that we would like to introduce it into the development of strategies more broadly, but it might take a while.
Okay, if this answers the question. Are there any other comments, questions, points of discussion? Okay, if there's nothing else, nobody wants to add to the conversation, to the discussion, then thank you all again for coming. Thank you, Dr. Berchtold, for the nice presentation, for the very interesting presentation. And I would
Thanks for the invitation.
Until next time.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.